Chapter 8. Unapologetically Yours. In a similar way to how my mother's affair with Steve ended, how this latest one began was also something of a mystery. All she'd reveal was that she'd fallen in love with a man by the name of Richard, who lived in Harrow, Middlesex. While occupying my usual spot on the floor by her feet as she listened to her music, Mum produced a photograph of her new love interest. A slightly overweight man with straight brown hair, full red lips and a moustache, Richard bore a striking resemblance to the shoestring actor Trevor Eve. In view of the fact that my mother had recently lost her third job in 2 years, and with no other occasion when they might have met, I could only conclude that she'd met Richard while at work. Indeed, my mother's latest dalliance represented the third time in the last 8 years that she'd seek satisfaction outside of her marriage. While this latest affair came about without any warning whatsoever, it would prove equally as disruptive as those with Bill and Steve. In keeping with the latter, Mum began disappearing of a Friday and would not return until the Sunday evening. With his fear of losing his wife dictating his initially tame response, my father once again let my mother go and offered little more than a feeble admonishment upon her return. While still invested in my mother's happiness, by this point I'd begun to feel conflicted by the realization that, yet again, she'd placed her own needs above everyone else's. Consequently, I found myself spending as much time as I could with my friends, and thereby reducing the amount of time I'd have to spend in the company of my father. Despite my best efforts to stay out of the house as much as possible, spending some time in the company of my father would prove unavoidable. While he'd continue to hit me around the head at any opportunity and hurl his time-tested clown, waster and toe rag barbs at me, his doing so would only deepen my resentment of him. Yet, this new mire in which he suddenly found himself had begun to detrimentally affect his already compromised health. With the anguish of his wife's latest infidelity becoming too difficult to bear, Dad began to experience sleepless nights and an explosion, literally, in the severity of his diarrhea. While the sound of Dad in the toilet would provide an endless source of amusement to the childish ears of Dee and me, his disrupted sleep would have consequences for me particularly. Unable to remain in bed, Dad began venturing downstairs in the middle of the night. Once down, Dad would come into the kitchen and turn the light, then boil a saucepan of milk to make a hot drink. With my bedroom located next to the kitchen, whether by the light shining through my window or the sound of boiling milk, I found myself waking up at the same time. After making his drink, Dad then sat in the lounge and read his paper, with the light from the lounge also shining through my bedroom window. Regardless of his disrupted sleep, Dad would still bring Dee and me a cup of tea at 7 o'clock each morning before school. Of a weekend, we were expected to return the favour, which we duly did. Whether made worse by my own disrupted sleep, I found my asthma symptoms worsening and began using my inhaler more frequently. Having run out of my rescue inhaler a couple of days before, I awoke one Sunday morning in November wheezing profusely. Unlike Dee, I never succeeded in making Dad's tea exactly the way he liked it. Yet, with it being my turn, I made his tea before setting the cup down on his bedside table. Breathless and wheezy as I spoke, I explained that I'd run out of my inhaler and asked Dad if he'd call the doctor. To this, Dad replied that as soon as he'd finished his tea, he was off to church, and that if I needed to see a doctor, I should phone one myself. Having by now become used to booking and attending my doctor's appointments alone, I rang the on-call doctor who came out and, after listening to my chest, provided me with a new inhaler. Interestingly, many years later, I'd have access to my medical records. While thumbing through them, I discovered an entry dated Sunday, November 18th, 1984. In addition to documenting the circumstances of their visit, the doctor wrote, "Mum's in London, Dad's in church. What's happening in this family?" What was happening was that my parents' marriage was failing. My mother was in London with her lover, my father was in the local Baptist church, and my sisters and I were left to fend for ourselves. With my mother's affair continuing come December, she would not allow the prospect of Christmas to spoil her fun, and left for London as usual on Friday 21st. Furthermore, with our sleep by now so seriously disrupted, and with my 12th birthday approaching on Sunday 23rd, in a rare display of generosity, Dad allowed me to top and tail with my 7-year-old sister upstairs in her bed. Making my way to Sass's room that Saturday night, I'd convinced myself that not only was my mother unlikely to make it home for my birthday, but for Christmas as well. In a sudden burst of frustration, I entered my parents' room where I removed from a drawer under their bed the Sony Walkman Mum had bought me for Christmas. To the sound of the tunes which made up the previous week's top 40, I eventually fell asleep. Stirring briefly from my slumber, I turned over and began to fall back to sleep. Just then, I felt something soft pressing against my cheek. To the scent of Pagan, my mother's favorite perfume, hanging in the air, I opened my eyes to the sight of my mother leaning over me. As I pulled the headphones off my ears, she kissed me again before wishing me a happy birthday. However, the warmth of her greeting gave way to a slightly sterner tone as she asked me why I had taken my Walkman. In as contrite a manner as I could muster, I replied that I didn't think she'd be back in time for my birthday, to which she called me a silly Billy and pointed out that she always returned home of a Sunday. 2 days later, and with the smell of the sherry and satsumas that we'd left out for Father Christmas still on her breath, my mother roused Dee, Sass and me early on Christmas morning. Predictably, we awoke to more expensive presents this Christmas than before, which I suspect had more to do with making up for her absence than a desire to do selfless good. As for Dad, he'd do what he always did on Christmas morning and arose later and joined us once we'd opened our presents. Surveying our gifts as he sat and drank his tea, Dad's composure belied the angst he must have felt as to how much all this had actually cost him. With the Christmas festivities now over, 1985 began as the previous year had ended, with my mother resuming her weekend trips to Harrow. Yet, trouble lay dead ahead, and one Saturday night in January brought an interesting development. Having gone to sleep in Sass's bed that night, I awoke to the sound of the phone ringing downstairs. As the phone never rang that late, I became instantly concerned that something might have happened to my mother. Climbing out of bed, I crept to the top of the stairs where I crouched down and listened while Dad spoke to the caller. Peering around the banisters, I spied my father sitting at the telephone table at the foot of the stairs. With the caller speaking for what seemed like an eternity, Dad sat and listened, interjecting only briefly now and then. As I began to lose interest, my father suddenly asking the caller what he should do and whether he should just beat my mother up immediately refocused my attention. As the conversation unfolded, Dad revealed to the caller how his wife had been making regular trips to Harrow over the past few months and how he suspected her of having an affair. After a few more minutes of listening and briefly interjecting, Dad requested the contact details of the caller before ending the call. With this, I crept back to bed, intrigued as to the identity of the mystery caller. Feeling ever more resentful of my father for disclosing my mother's business, I went to sleep determined to tell her all about it when she came home. We wouldn't have to wait too long to learn something of the unknown caller. Indeed, the following day, Dad revealed to Dee and me some of what he'd learned during the previous night's call. Sparing us none of the details, Dad confirmed that Richard, the man with whom Mum had been having an affair, had also been having affairs simultaneously with 2 other women. After having learned of each other's existence, the 3 women united to confront him at his Harrow address. Alarmingly, the confrontation had resulted in fisticuffs, with my mother's whereabouts currently unknown. As if this were not enough, my father went on to reveal that, although he could not confirm at that time from where the funds came, my mother had spent £2,000 on a Jaguar car, which she had subsequently gifted to Richard. While resentment towards my mother had begun to build, it hadn't yet reached the same level as that for my father, and my lack of sympathy for him remained undiminished. Indeed, following his disclosure, I offered one of my own, by revealing to my father that I'd overheard him on the phone the previous night and witnessed how he'd betrayed my mother. My resentment for him getting the better of me, I called him an upstart, a term he would often use against me before attempting to walk away. However, I wouldn't get very far. With the shock of discovering that his wife having another affair, coupled with the devastating news that she had potentially landed them both in £2,000 worth of debt, Dad suddenly snapped. As he lunged towards me, I turned around and ran up the stairs and only made it halfway up before Dad pinned me down and began belting me around the head. As the blows rained down, I could do little beyond raise my arms to cushion myself from them. Unleashing a torrent of frustration all his own, with each lashing, Dad merely strengthened my already seething resentment for him. After what seemed like an eternity, Dad stopped, at which point I fled upstairs to Sass's room and slammed the door. With my knees up against my chest and arms wrapped around my ankles, I buried my head between my legs and, with my upper body throbbing, began to sob. Right there, in that very moment, I hated him. I'd begun to hate her, and not only that, I'd begun to hate just about everybody. Despite the negative thoughts stirring within me towards my mother, when she arrived home later that day, I could not have been more relieved to see her. With her back to me as I entered the kitchen, I found my mother standing at the sink. Next to her was a plastic bag from which she pulled a blood-stained blouse. As she began soaking the blouse in the washing up bowl, my mother looked at me and saw that I'd been crying. No sooner had she asked what had been going on than Dad chimed in that I had the hump after he'd thrashed me on the stairs. Following my confirmation that Dad had hit me around the head once again, Mum began to berate him. With the presence of blood on Mum's blouse unexplained, once she'd finished tearing into Dad, I asked her if she'd been hurt in a fight. To her admission that the blood on her blouse belonged to someone else, Dad revealed to Mum that he'd been made aware of the events occurring in Harrow the previous day. To the sound of raised voices, I awoke later that evening. Climbing out of bed, I ventured down the stairs. Stopping halfway down and close enough to hear Mum and Dad through the closed living room door, I sat and listened. Expecting to hear them arguing about Mum's affair in addition to the revelations made by the mystery caller and from where the money came to purchase a £2,000 car, I was dismayed to discover that instead they were arguing about me. Growing frustrated that each attack on me would be met with a defensive reply from Mum, my father suddenly declared that he loathed me. Much like the moment during one of their previous arguments when I first heard the word compromise, I'd subsequently look up the word loathe in the dictionary and wasn't at all surprised when I discovered what it meant. Suffice to say, the feeling was mutual, and with the rapid succession of events in the weeks that followed, my resentment towards my father would descend into unmitigated hate. The series of events began with my mother returning to Harrow in an unsuccessful attempt to retrieve the car she'd bought for Richard. The following Monday, I returned to school. With Dee off sick that particular day, I'd make my way home on the bus alone. Upon arriving home, I found my mother sitting in the armchair next to her hi-fi unit with her headphones on. Crouching down by her feet, I could sense that something was wrong and asked her what had happened. With this, my mother turned up her top lip to reveal a large purple bruise on the inside of her mouth. Immediately, I knew Dad had hit her again. Wasting no time at all, I ran straight upstairs to find my father in his room getting ready for work, and Dee alone in hers. Heading straight to Dee's room, I found her still clearly in a state of shock. When I asked her what had happened, Dee explained that our father had beaten Mum up because she'd refused to do his dinner. Furthermore, and in a rare departure from her kinship with him, Dee proceeded to describe Dad as a psycho. Crouching down, Dee then knelt on the floor beside her bed and reaching underneath. To my surprise, Dee pulled out a broken metal chair leg, which she said she intended to use in the event that Dad started again. It being likely that Dad had overheard our conversation, he found the chair leg before leaving for work. Eyeing my father as he walked to the garage at the end of our back garden, I witnessed him throwing the chair leg over a fence. No sooner had he gone than I ran out and climbed the fence before retrieving the chair leg, which I then concealed under my bed. As if hearing Dee's account of what had happened wasn't bad enough, my father would subsequently relate the entire series of events to the very person with whom he'd always have a captive audience. While I'd anticipated some trouble, had I known what would actually transpire during our visit to my maternal grandparents, I would have tried my best to avoid going. However, in a scene reminiscent of 2 years ago, Dee and I sat together in the kind of dutiful silence that we always did when visiting relatives, while Dad, with Sass under his arm, had command of the floor. Although the name of the man involved may have changed, the sordid details had not, and nor, predictably, would Nanny's reaction. Yet, during their conversation, Dad would reveal a few details hitherto unknown to us children. Firstly, my father chose this moment to disclose that the mystery caller that Saturday night happened to be one of the spurned females involved in 3 simultaneous affairs with the caddish Richard. Secondly, he revealed that the money used to purchase the Jaguar had come courtesy of a loan for which he and my mother were both liable. Right on cue, and continuing where she left off following Mum's affair with Steve, Nanny launched into another bitter tirade against her daughter. However, this time she'd have an ally equally opposed to my mother, about to join us to put in her 2 pennies worth. Before then, Nanny declared once again how Mum had broken her father's heart, without explaining precisely how, followed by the suggestion that Dad ought to sell our house in Chestnut Drive and move us all into a council house. On the basis that my mother wouldn't deign to live in a council house, Dad dismissed Nanny's suggestion out of hand. By now, clearly irritated by Dad's inability to take control of the situation, Nanny suggested that Dad beat Mum up, to which he replied that he'd already done that a few weeks ago, bragging that at one point he really started whipping her. Having witnessed Dad's assault on Mum, and understandably distraught at having to relive it, Dee suddenly burst into tears. As she did so, Nanny's sister, the fearsome Auntie Joyce, came into the room. Sobbing uncontrollably, Dee got up to leave the room, but was stopped in her tracks by Auntie Joyce. Despite being by now 14 years old and slightly taller than her great-aunt, the merciless Auntie Joyce grabbed Dee by the arm and, while pulling her back into the room, yelled at her that if she left the room now, she'd end up a whore like her mother. With this, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the adrenaline began coursing through my body. Forced back into her seat, Dee continued to cry. Tellingly, not once did Dad make a move to console his daughter or criticize Auntie Joyce for her manhandling of Dee or adding to her distress. Instead, Dad turned his attention back to Nanny, who pointed at me and asked him whose side I was on. With Dad's confirmation that my loyalties lie with my mother, I waited for a reproof from Nanny that, surprisingly, didn't come. Next, she glanced over at 7-year-old Sass and asked which side she was on, following which Dad pulled her close before declaring that she was with him. Nodding her approval, Nanny appeared gratified to learn that all but one person in the room was against her much-detested daughter. With Nanny and Auntie Joyce suitably wound up, Dad unburdened, and Dee and I emotionally wrecked, we headed home to Maidstone. Despite my innate boldness, I hadn't lost sight of the fact that children at that time were indoctrinated to respect their elders. Yet, the elders in my life were not respectable people, nor did they behave in a way worthy of respect. Indeed, my relatives allowed their resentment of my mother to prevail over any concern they felt for my sisters and me. Furthermore, at no time did any of them, my father included, talk to us with any tenderness about our feelings and how all this had impacted us. In time, I'd come to know myself as someone perfectly capable of respecting others, especially when given something to respect, while withholding respect for those not worthy of it. Indeed, it would not be unfair to contend that my mother gave me precious little to respect. Moreover, following a devastating act of betrayal against me later on that year, 1985 would signal a dramatic change in my relationship with my mother, against whom I'd begin to rebel in earnest. As was the case on 2 previous occasions, my parents were once again tenuously reconciled. Unlike before, my mother would have only one song, a reflective, wistful ballad by John Denver and Placido Domingo entitled Perhaps Love, to encapsulate her emotions. With her character firmly fixed, it would only be a matter of time before she'd revert to type and the inevitable chaos ensue. In a little over a year's time, my mother would succeed beyond her wildest dreams in finally tearing her family apart. With her own character also firmly fixed, while Nanny would provide us with a much-needed lifeline, she'd soon withdraw it when it no longer suited her. In the meantime, with my 13th birthday fast approaching, I'd meet a girl who, along with her mother, would subsequently come to my rescue at a time when my so-called family seemed all too content to let me drown.
Never thought I'd get here, just one of 33. On the lookout for a likely gang of nut jobs just like me, flung together as if by fate. Was Justin Stewart and me, Simone the copper's daughter, and let's not forget Penny, a lank, a nerd and a fatty, but we love her anyway. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay. Finger and sing it, boys and girls, was the music teacher's cry. To us her words meant something else, and the cheers began to fly. On the facts of life in science, said the teacher, remember this, get it right and you can't go wrong. It's not penis, it's penis. A lank, a nerd and a fatty, but we love her anyway. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay. Down at Smoker's Corner to grab a cheeky drag, dinner ladies on the prowl. Quick, hide that nudie mag. Did it in her bedroom, you can take that to the bank. This bragging lad puts me to shame, only just had my first wank. A lank, a nerd and a fatty, but we love her anyway. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay. A lank, a nerd and a fatty, but we love her anyway. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay. Hey. And we think that Hilsey's gay. But we love her anyway. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay. Poor Penny, she gets called a slag, and we think that Hilsey's gay.
I'm not